My name is Elena Sokova. I'm the Executive Director of the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. And I would really like to welcome those of you who are joining us today on behalf of the center, and mention that this is our first webinar. So please bear with us if there are any technical glitches or some other technical problems. Hopefully we won't have, but just in case. Many of you who are from Vienna are really used to coming to our seminars where we feature a number of interesting speakers on topics related to nuclear and other WMD, non-proliferation and disarmament. But as we all are now in the COVID-19 situation, we, as many other organizations, are resorting to various online platforms to bring to you speakers that address some of the topics that are usually covered by the center in our public seminars, in our activities. This provides actually quite an interesting new opportunity. As we looked at the people who registered for the seminar today, many of them are coming from different countries and even different continents. So it allows us actually to reach a much larger audience, which is a great opportunity. We had 200 registrations for this seminar, and people are still logging in. In order for us to have a good and productive discussion today, I'm really pleased to introduce a really renowned expert on North Korea and a professor of East Asian economy and society at the University of Vienna, Dr. Rüdiger Frank. He's one of the few North Korea experts that actually spent some time in the country and studied there in the early 1990s. He has written extensively on various topics related to North Korea, including its economic history, the connections between ideology and economic reform after the 1990s famine, the political economy of unification, and many other issues. He has been working with the World Economic Forum. That's actually where I first met Professor Frank. I believe it was 2014. And he's been working with the World Economic Forum since 2011 and was named one of the 50 most influential German economists in 2012. So the topic of today's seminar is about the economy in North Korea. But as many of you saw from the announcement of the center, the economy is underpinning many political processes and state of affairs in every country in the world. But there is certainly a connection between the North Korea's economy and its weapons of mass destruction program, both in terms of funding, in terms of the ability to acquire, procure materials and technologies, or even having resources for its WMD program. So, in my view, it's a very important way of looking at the connection between economy and nuclear program in North Korea, particularly as we also look at the effect of the sanctions. With that introduction and with these few technical rules of today's seminar, I'm really pleased to pass the floor to Professor Frank, and I'm so delighted you were able to join us and look forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much, Elena, and thanks also for having me. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you who are tuned in, depending on where you are at the moment. It's a great opportunity, I think, to use this kind of new technologies And as we discussed before, I really hope that some of that will actually stick even after we have achieved something like a normalization. I'm really not that keen on traveling, and I think this is a very, very effective way of spreading ideas and having an exchange. I'm also very much looking forward to critical comments and questions after my presentation. So this is what I'm going to talk about. It's basically two topics, if you like. The one is how North Korea's economy is connected to actually a wide range of issues that the international community is really concerned about. And one of those issues, obviously, is the nuclear program, and I will devote most of the time to that part of the relevance. Then in the second part, I will look at the latest data on North Korea's economy, in particular the budget report that was issued in April 2020, so very recently. And then I will try to connect those two parts by asking what is actually the impact on those various issues of concern that we actually have. So let's start briefly with the humanitarian situation. I think the link here is pretty obvious. If the economy suffers, then the consumers suffer as well. There is another link that is more politically relevant. There is a challenge to regime legitimacy, obviously, if we would see a repetition of the story of the mid-1990s, where actually there was a huge famine in North Korea. This would threaten the stability of the regime. So therefore, a bad economy would actually be a warning sign that there might be a bit of a challenge to regime stability in North Korea. And as we just experienced in the last weeks with all those rumors about the health of Kim Jong-un, this stability of the regime is actually of a major concern to the international community. And by the way, this connection between economic suffering and unhappiness and then challenge to regime stability is also, or has been, rationale behind many sanctions that have been issued against North Korea. In particular, I'm talking about the I'm talking about comprehensive sanctions, excuse me. So the non-specific sanctions. On the economy and human rights, I think the link is perhaps less obvious, but I think it's equally strong. Again, excuse me for keeping this very simple. We typically observe a higher chance of human rights violations in societies that are either economically poor or economically stressed. Reasons for that are various. Amongst them is also simply the setting of priorities, or people being busy with surviving and therefore having less energy left for resistance and related matters. But again, I think the connection is there and it's pretty strong. Now, turning to, I think what you are interested in the most is the economy and the nuclear program. I have identified three issues. There are more, but these three is what I want to focus on, where this actually matters. Before I go into a little bit more detail about those three, let me just start by challenging a simple assumption that sometimes is made implicitly, not necessarily explicitly. And that is that North Korea imports crucial components of its nuclear program from somewhere abroad. And therefore, efforts at reducing those imports will actually have an impact on the nuclear program. And since there is an interest at curtailing or even ending that nuclear program, we had many, many sanctions, especially until 2017, that targeted particularly that area. But as a matter of fact, as we all know, it's empirical evidence, North Korea did continue nuclear testing and the development of WMDs, or weapons of mass destruction. So with this simple logic, there must be something wrong. There must be an error in this kind of calculation. So a question that I actually think we really need to ask ourselves is, what is it exactly that North Korea imports for its nuclear program if it does so? If you go through, and maybe I should add a disclaimer here, although my father was a nuclear physicist, I'm not really an expert on nuclear technology. So forgive my somewhat layperson's approach here, and I'm happy to stand corrected. Anyway, if you look at some of the obvious issues, like for example, uranium that you need for nuclear weapons, do the North Koreans import that? No, they don't, because they have uranium in their own country. So that doesn't work. What about technology? Yes, we do have evidence that North Korea has been very active in acquiring nuclear-related technology from abroad. The thing is, once you have it, you have it. You don't have to do this on a continuous basis. It's not like an annual import of technology that you need to maintain your nuclear program. And we know that the North Koreans have been pretty active in this field since the 1950s, 60s. I personally witnessed that in the 1970s when we lived in the Soviet Union in a nuclear research center, actually. And we all know about the news of the AQ Khan network. So this is relevant, but it has already been done. Then there is this topic of aluminum tubes for uranium enrichment. That has been a very big issue. Same for missile engines and launching vehicles. But again, my very naive perspective is that these very specialized products are not produced by too many countries worldwide. So it shouldn't be so difficult to actually identify those companies and make sure that they do not sell this kind of product to North Korea. So unless somebody with more expertise manages to convince me otherwise, my working hypothesis also for today's presentation is that North Korea actually produces all major components of its WMD program domestically. And this means that the relationship between North Korea's economy and the WMD program is actually very obvious. If the economy does well, they have more resources at their disposal and vice versa. So the nuclear war, first thing here on my list that I wanted to talk about. I think there's little disagreement over the fact that North Korea will basically cease to exist if it would ever really use nuclear weapons. So there is only one scenario under which North Korea would really make such a suicidal move, and that would be total desperation and fear of an immediate collapse of the regime. In addition, of course, to being attacked first. Then they might also feel compelled to use this kind of weapon. But otherwise, it's very unlikely. So we see the connection again here between the economic situation and the potential use of nuclear weapons. And that's why I also put this term desperation in the title of my presentation, not to imply that North Korea is desperate, but I tried to show that it is actually quite important for us to understand whether it is and how desperate it is, if that would be our analysis. So a deteriorating economy would, I think, really increase the risk of a nuclear war. And therefore, data on North Korea's economy should be treated as an early warning sign for such a scenario that really nobody actually wants. Sorry. The second point I have here is nuclear safety. Those of you who are experts, they will perhaps remember the early 1990s and the almost panic that existed amongst experts over the situation in the former Soviet Union. And there was this question, what will now happen to all these nuclear facilities as the country, or the countries as it split up, did a deep dive into economic crisis. Like, if you have no real money to maintain anything, why would we believe that they are able to maintain those nuclear facilities? And even highly developed countries have their experience of nuclear accidents. The last one, the very tragic events of Fukushima in Japan. So the economic situation in that regard would have a very strong impact on nuclear safety in North Korea. If there is no money in the economy, who's going to pay for maintaining strict safeguard measures? And then finally, on nuclear non-proliferation, my impression after all those years and decades also of interaction with DPRK officials is that they actually know quite well and understand that selling nuclear material or devices would come at a very, very high political or even military cost. And that's why they really have refrained from it and have declared many times that they do not intend to proliferate nuclear material or devices. Because this could be the red line that once it has been crossed would compel the United States, for example, to act and implement plans that have existed at least since the Clinton era, which would be a preemptive or surgical strike on North Korean nuclear facilities, which would, of course, have incalculable consequences in terms of a North Korean response, counter-response, and so on. One doesn't need too much fantasy to imagine how this could lead into disaster. So from a North Korean perspective, the economic benefit arising from such a risky thing as proliferation must be high enough in relative terms to justify that risk. And to me, this is only thinkable if all other options have become unavailable or failed, And if the economy is so bad that it's in itself, the economic situation becomes threatening for the very existence of the economics of the system, political system or leadership in North Korea. Therefore, I think a deep economic crisis in North Korea would increase the risk of proliferation. And this is another reason why I think we really should have a very close eye on what is going on in North Korea economically. I also have the point of leadership stability here. I added it, I admit, because of the recent rumors around Kim Jong-un, and because this has helped us to understand or to reminded us of the fact that the leader plays such a crucial role for stability of the regime, and the stability of the regime term is actually quite important for all those issues of concern, including those related to the nuclear question. The thing is that political legitimacy can basically come from two sources. One source would be following agreed procedures. This is what we know, for example, in a democracy where you have elections, or even in a monarchy, actually, where you have a rather well prescribed order of succession. And that in itself gives the one who has then been chosen as a leader the legitimacy to actually be the leader. North Korea, however, is very different. It's neither a Western-style democracy, nor is it a monarchy, although it's often wrongly perceived as such. So none of those actually works as a source for legitimacy. Rather, leadership in North Korea has actually always been performance-based. Now, mind you, this doesn't have to be actual performance. It's enough if it is perceived performance, if people understand it as such. So Kim Il-sung, for example, was always seen in North Korea as the liberator of the country from the Japanese, which is a great achievement. As the defender of the country against an attack by the United States, which is how North Korea interprets the Korean War, and also, of course, as the creator of the very state of the DPRK, or Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Kim Jong-il was promoted in North Korean ideology and media as, well, that's my own formulation here, the best student of the creator. So he was his right-hand man for a long time. There have been numerous images showing him how both were actually working hand in hand. So that gave him a lot of legitimacy. And later he was lauded as the defender of the country, this time against all those forces that resulted in a collapse of the socialist bloc, which North Korea was able to survive. So that was the performance-based legitimacy foundation for Kim Jong-il. And then Kim Jong-un, what is his legitimacy source? It's economic development. Right after he came to power in December 2011, he started making such statements. And it's actually quite clear that this is what he tells his people: if I'm your leader, because I will, of course, maintain all those great achievements achieved by my predecessors, but in particular, I will improve our economic situation. And everything that we have observed in the last 8 years since he has been in power actually supports that, which then means that the legitimacy of the North Korean leadership and its stability is very, very closely, and actually more closely than before, connected to economic performance of the North Korean economy. And just on a side note, since some of you might wonder, wait a second, don't they have this succession rule that son should always succeed father or something? De facto, yes, but not explicitly. It is never written down anywhere. It's not in the constitution. There has been never ever a mentioning of any of Kim Jong-un or Kim Jong-il being the sons of their respective father. You never find this formulation. The closest North Korea gets to acknowledging this is the so-called Paektu bloodline, Paektu-san being the mountain of the revolution to the north. But that's about it. And if you look at it closely, Kim Jong-il was the eldest son, but Kim Jong-un, for example, is the third son of his father. So this is clearly and emphatically not a monarchy. Being a relative helps, but it has never really been cited officially as a reason for the legitimacy of that leader. That's why I think the economy, especially in the case of Kim Jong-un, really, really matters the most in this regard. So before I show you just a few data, don't worry, it's not going to be too much. I need to issue another disclaimer. This is data from North Korea, and that should be taken with a few buckets of salt. As an economist, I'm tempted to say, like every data, it's always a bit of a problem if you try to simplify complex things into a few numbers. But in the case of North Korea, and especially again, that debate about the health of Kim Jong-un has just highlighted this once more. It's very, very difficult to get reliable data from North Korea or about North Korea. And economic data is really no difference in this regard. What we as North Korea specialists or researchers do in order to kind of solve that dilemma is we try to take a long-term perspective. We try to find patterns, and we try to understand systems rather than just looking at anecdotal data that pop up completely out of context. And one of my attempts to do this has been to, in the last 20 years, to follow the budget data that the North Korean parliament publishes annually during its sessions. So the North Korean parliament, called Supreme People's Assembly, meets at least once a year, usually in April. There might be exemptions. And during those meetings, they have two reports that are significant to me in this regard. One is a general report on the status of the economy, and the other is that budget report that I just talked about, usually delivered by the Minister of Finance. The downside is that they do not provide any absolute figures. So they do not tell us our budget had the size of, say, 30 billion North Korean won. They actually operate with change rates. So they say, well, the state budget revenue compared to last year has increased by 4%. For next year, we plan to have an increase of 4.2%. This is usually what you find. Beyond that, these reports are actually quite detailed. It's not just general aggregate numbers that you get, but you also get quite a lot of detail. And again, don't worry, I'm not going to expand more on that because it is very complex. But if you follow this systematically, it is actually possible to really derive some conclusions. And talking about the reliability of data, as a scholar, one of the techniques that we use to eliminate an error is using the same, using sources that contain the same error. So in a way, if you look at changes between those sources, assuming the error is always the same, what remains is an actual development that you can observe. Well, at least theoretically, this is how it should work. So here are the main points on North Korea's budget report, what we learned from it. We find that the North Korean economy is still very much inward oriented. That makes good sense because they are basically excluded from almost any legal form of international economic cooperation. We neither find signs of a major crisis nor of a major economic breakthrough. So we are somewhere in the middle. Interestingly, the 5-year economic development plan, which was supposed actually to be ended this year to meet the anniversary of the Workers' Party Foundation, that plan has not been mentioned anymore. So that started somewhere later last year when that issue was basically dropped from official announcements. It's a bit like Kim Jong-un not showing up on April 15th. It's definitely noteworthy. The question is, what does it mean? One interpretation is there must be problems with that development plan, and that's why it is not being mentioned. We do not really have more evidence on that, but I think it's still noteworthy. Also interesting is that the term sanctions did not appear a single time in any of those two reports that I analyzed. This actually corresponds very well with the official DPRK position, as I was able to witness it in a couple of settings, in particular since the second half of 2019. And this, in a nutshell, is basically, we don't care about sanctions. Whether you leave them, whether you drop them, doesn't matter. We will develop our economy independently no matter what. Now, that's the official position. It doesn't mean that sanctions are without any effect. In fact, it's hard not to see how they do negatively affect North Korea's economy. But the official position is we don't care, which is, of course, important for potential negotiations. A very remarkable point is grain production. There was just one sentence on grain production in the budget, in the economic report, saying that grain production has reached the highest ever levels. Now, of course, highest ever is always kind of a fuzzy term. North Korea had claimed to have production of about 8 to 9 million tons of grain annually in the 1970s and 80s. This clearly has not been reached, but if we compare this to the latest data by the World Food Programme, They estimate North Korea's grain production in 2019 to be about 6.5 million tons. Just to give you some kind of point for comparison, that is about 1 million more than in 2018. And North Korea needs roughly 5 million tons to be self-sustainable in food supply, at least in terms of availability of food. We are not talking about accessibility, but in terms of availability, 5 million as a rule of thumb, that's what they need. If it's below, you can expect huge problems in terms of feeding the population. If it's more, it's a good sign. So if those 6.5 million tons that the WFP has been writing in its materials as an estimate, if that would actually be true, that would be a sign of a strength of North Korea's economy, at least in that field. We find some interesting self-criticism in both reports that were delivered on the economy. Now, if you have been following North Korea in the last years, you might have noticed that they are actually quite often self-critical. Kim Jong-un, for example, in his long report at the Party Congress in 2016, spoke in very drastic terms about corruption, about inefficiency, about party cadres not working for the population. In one of his New Year's speeches, he actually officially even questioned his own ability to really handle all these difficult issues and so on. So the tone itself is not new, but finding that in a budget report is new, especially the formulation that there are some drawbacks in executing the state budget, quote unquote. This is a hint at economic problems that might not have been there before. And my interpretation would be that this could be related to COVID-19 and the fallout from that, especially the effective closure of the border with China. In terms of the actual growth, economic planners in North Korea seem to be cautiously optimistic about the prospects for the development in 2020. What's interesting is that the evidence they present on that is actually very interesting and I would say slightly questionable. And I'm going to show you a little bit on that in a minute. Now, first of all, this is a graph I have created for growth rates in North Korea's state budget. Please focus your attention only on the orange curve for the moment. What you see is a number of interesting things. You see, they had economic reforms in 2002. All of a sudden, they became very optimistic about the economy. I should add that I take North Korea's state budget as a proxy for the North Korean economy. So state budget growth, especially growth of revenue, is my kind of proxy for GDP growth, because they do not publish any data on GDP growth. But the connection is obvious, and in particular in a country where the state is the economy, with the exception of the military-owned economy that's not included here, and the private economy. But I think both are actually more dynamic than this part. So this is actually a very conservative proxy. Now, back to that graph, you see we had those reform years, 2002, going really up. 2003 was the year of the Iraq War, where North Korean reforms stalled because security concerns took over. Then we have the year of the nuclear tests, the first nuclear test in 2006, and sanctions that started then that actually drove the curve further down. Then we see growing optimism. And since Kim Jong-un has been in power, 2012, 13, we see actually relatively, well, I would say realistic expectations, which also increases my trust in this kind of data. It's not like a socialist country during the Cold War that claimed to have exceeded their targets annually. They are actually relatively realistic. And if you look at the past years, see how this orange curve goes. You see here, this is when Donald Trump and these comprehensive sanctions kick in. So we see the growth expectations go down, and now they go up again. So let's focus on this number just a little bit. 2020, 4-point-something% that they expect as a growth figure for this year. But the thing is, the numbers don't add up. Again, according to that very same report, about 80% of this state budget revenue actually comes from two sources: transaction taxes and profits from state enterprise. Then the same report provides detailed growth expectations for those two items. And remember, these are responsible for 80% of growth. And each of those items is expected to grow just 1%. So I don't think you have to be a rocket scientist to understand that somehow that doesn't work. If the whole economy is going to grow by 4%, and 80% of it are growing by only 1%. How is that possible? Well, you could say the other 20% will then provide for all that growth. But I don't see how this is going to happen. If you look at other components, like income from real estate rent, for example, it's almost down to zero. And not surprisingly, income from economic and trade zones is expected to be only growing by 0.3% next year. So that is another interesting sign showing that something might actually be wrong in this case. So what does that tell us about the status of North Korea's economy at the moment? I think not very surprisingly, those parts of the economy that rely on on external economic relations are not doing very well. But so far, we don't really see an economic crisis in North Korea, but we see some issues coming up. The state has taken some rather unusual measures in the last weeks. You might also have heard about that. For example, issuing bonds. Bonds have for the last time been issued in 2003, and back then in a very awkward fashion, basically as a lottery. And I think before that, the last time bonds were issued was during the Korean War. So that's not something they do regularly. Now issuing bonds, therefore, needs to be regarded as an exceptional measure, also indicating some kind of increased need by the state to collect resources from the domestic economy. We see import restrictions and de facto tax increases also, if we can trust all these anecdotal reports from North Korea. So, coming to my last point, the impact of those facts on the economy, on the issues of concern as I have outlined them at the very beginning. I do not think that we should expect an immediate economic crisis. Now, again, a disclaimer, I have lived through German unification and our peaceful revolution in 1989 and 1990, and I didn't see it coming. So I'm not really very good at predicting things, and I'm very careful, not least out of that experience, but so far, that's what I really can say. There are no signs of an immediate economic crisis. We have issues there, but not a serious crisis. So if you would like to see the regime collapse, this is perhaps not going to happen. It's also not the case that North Korea is desperate, in a sense that if you make them a good offer, or as President Trump calls it, try to strike a deal, they would be willing to trade away their valued nuclear program against a few economic goodies. I don't think current status of the economy supports the notion that they would actually be desperate enough to do that. And if you assume that the resources available for North Korea's nuclear program are correlated to the status of the North Korean economy, it means that they still have enough funds to keep developing it. However, there are problems. So it's not all rosy in North Korea. There are issues, as I just pointed out. So what could that mean? It means that we should be extra careful on the issue of proliferation. Again, I don't think they are yet desperate enough to do such a stupid, sorry to say that, stupid move as selling nuclear material, but we should just keep observing the situation. Because if North Korea should indeed move into an economic crisis, this prospect would become more of a threat and more of a risk. Same goes for nuclear safety. If resources have to be saved in order to maintain more vital parts of the economy and of the system, then of course, nuclear safeguards will become perhaps of a secondary importance. The other points I think I already made them. A possible first use of nuclear weapons, I find that very unlikely. And North Korea has actually repeatedly declared it doesn't want to do it. So the only scenario, as I said before, is if we really have basically the last stand before the system goes down. And it doesn't really look like that at the moment. Yeah, another humanitarian disaster. We do, of course, get these reports from WFP and FAO on the needs in North Korea. Not everybody has enough food. We have issues of malnutrition in North Korea. So for 2019, the harvest looks pretty good, but we should not forget that the economy as such in general has an impact on agricultural performance. There are many inputs that are needed for agricultural production. And if the economy as such doesn't function, agriculture inevitably suffers too. And that could then quickly lead into another famine or famine-like situation. Human rights, the same thing. If the economy is doing badly, then the regime might actually be willing to be more strict on imposing its rule on its people, including what in the West has often been criticized as human rights violations. And then finally, the stability of Kim Jong-un's leadership. I argued that it's closely connected to economic performance. So if we would actually see a crisis, and there are a few signs that things are getting worse, I think that would also have an impact on how Kim Jong-un would conduct his policies in North Korea. Well, that was what I wanted to say. It looks like I kept the time limit, more or less. So
yes.
Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to your questions.